morning again. Thank you for being here online in the room. We're in the middle of a conversation called This Is Us, talking about 4 ways that we can improve every relationship. And I had to bring in like a real good preacher this week. Somebody actually knew more about this topic than I did. I'm still working on it, especially, around certain sports things, but... No, Reverend Kim Jenne is a director of Connectional Ministries. All the Methodist churches in Missouri, we have a central office in Columbia, and that's where she works out of. But we've been friends for a long time.
Yes, we have.
And years ago, she was feeling a heart tug. And maybe some of you have wanted to talk about what would it look like to become a pastor? And you were working in advertising then. But she said, I want to start thinking about what it would take to become a pastor. And so I was your mentor through that process, which means all the amazing things she's learned and all that she's done in a phenomenal sermon today. She's done all of that even with me holding her back for the first few years. So thank you for being here. Let's give her a hand, and I'm excited to have Kim.
Thank you, Mike. I have known him for a very long time now. It's shocking to me. And when he invited me to be a part of This Is Us, your sermon series, I got really excited because I love the show. And then he told me that I had to preach on forgiveness, which I thought was like really uncool of him to do because it's like super hard, forgiveness. And so thank you, Mike, for punting on that one and leaving me with some really hard work in this 3rd week of your series, This Is Us. You've already discussed the importance of being intentional, right? Because significant, meaningful relationships, they don't just happen. They're built. They require actual intention to kind of build, to grow, and to deepen. And last week, which I watched online from my home in Columbia, got to participate as part of your worshiping community, was about listening and about that basic but essential principle of growing all of our relationships so that we can be a little quick to listen and slow to speak, which is an eternal lesson that we all have to work on. And so if you didn't get a chance to hear those 2 sermons, I encourage you to go back through the church app or the website or Facebook and catch up on those or share those with someone that you love, someone that you're in relationship with, so that you can have a cup of coffee together and share about the ways in which you can grow and deepen your own relationship. So today we're going to talk about this 3rd principle, an essential principle to creating and sustaining significant, meaningful relationships, and that is the principle of forgiveness. Now, sometimes when people think of the word forgiveness, we often create a word picture in our minds, and since we're churchy kind of folk, perhaps one of the word pictures that we come up with or imagine in our mind is that story of the prodigal son in the New Testament. The errant boy come home into his forgiving father's arms to receive forgiveness. So that might be one image that we create when we think of forgiveness. And then there are some of us who think of kind of like those shallow platitudes that you might find on Hallmark cards, right? Kind of those cheesy little sayings, right? So I want to make sure that when we're talking about forgiveness today, at least in our conversation over the next several minutes, I want to talk about a kind of a gritty kind of forgiveness. Not the kind of don't let the sun go down on your anger, forgive and forget kind of forgiveness. Rather, I want to talk about the you punched a hole in the wall of our friendship kind of forgiveness. And I'm not sure we're actually going to survive. So that's the kind of level of forgiveness that we're going to talk about today. Not those shallow platitudes that you might see on posters or on cards in the store. And when we talk about forgiveness in church, we often invoke Jesus' words, which is always a good place to start with Jesus, right? And there's a particular story in the New Testament that often gets trotted out for these forgiveness sermons. And that's the one where Jesus reminds Peter that you're not to forgive someone 7 times, but actually you're supposed to forgive people 7 times 70 times. And I've heard that sermon a lot of times over the course of my life. And I always find it a little too theoretical, like a little like too much of an intellectual exercise. It doesn't feel very real to me. It feels like something we just think about, or it's an ideal we want to reach. There's actually a story way back in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, the first book of our Bible, that I think really represents a good forgiveness story, a story of what it's really like to try to live out forgiveness in our daily lives. Do y'all remember the story of Joseph and his brothers? Do you remember that story? Joseph of the Technicolor coat variety, right? Do you remember what happened to Joseph? Anybody? Joseph didn't get along with his brothers very well. He was the cherished child of Jacob, and his brothers felt like he was getting a little bit too much attention. So they hatch a plan to kidnap him, and then they even talked about killing him, but their brother Reuben said, let's not do that. That seems like going way beyond the pale. And so they end up taking him and selling him to a group of people called the Ishmaelites. And once they get him out of their hair, they go back to their father, and they tell their father that Joseph was hurt by a wild animal and died out in the wilderness. So you might recall that story. It's a pretty popular Sunday school story. And you might even remember what actually happens next in the story, which is kind of an unbelievable tale of climbing the ladder. Because Joseph, after the Ishmaelites, gets sold to the Egyptians, and he ends up, through some divine intervention, rising from the position of slave to essentially what is the vice president of Egypt, which is a pretty impressive jump in power, right? To go from slave to Pharaoh's right-hand man. And his family even reconciles with him, because they come to Egypt in the midst of a big famine, asking for help, and they discover Joseph is in power, and Joseph reconciles with his brothers and his father, and we sometimes think that's the end of the story. So I'm wondering if you actually remember what happens next, because it doesn't make it into the musical. It's the part that the very end of Genesis, the very last chapter, we hear that Jacob, Joseph's father, finally dies. And after his death, all that is left are the kids, right? Their moms are gone, moms plural. Leah and Rachel, their mothers, have died. And now dad is dead. And Joseph's older brothers begin to ask one another, if Joseph bears any resentment toward us for all of the evil that we caused him, surely he's going to pay us back. You see, they're not quite rid of the guilt that they have from selling their brother for 20 pieces of silver way back in chapter 37. And they start to ask themselves, what if we really get what we deserve? What if we really get what's coming to us? What if Joseph hasn't truly forgiven us and he exacts his revenge upon us? And that's the part of the story that we're going to pick up on today to talk about forgiveness. So this is from chapter 50 in the book of Genesis, starting with verse 15, and I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show us his anger and pay us back for all of the wrong that we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves before Joseph, saying, look, we are your slaves. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to care for you and your children." So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Now, Jacob's older sons are convinced that their former ill deeds are going to be lorded over them by Joseph. And so they want to renegotiate the terms of their relationship now that dear old dad is gone. They're convinced that it was their father's life that kept Joseph's revenge at bay. Now, there's been nothing for those of us that are reading along in Genesis to have any sense that Jacob was actually harboring any ill will. Like, we don't have any evidence of that. But their betrayal, their guilt looms so large now that the dad buffer is gone. Now, this story has always felt like real family drama. It's like, this is how families actually behave and act. And so I think there's some really helpful, practical wisdom that we can glean from this story as we're thinking about the role of forgiveness in our lives and in the relationships, whether it's intimate relationships or friendships or even platonic work relationships. And the first is this: know what forgiveness is and why it matters. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what forgiveness actually is. People are often resistant to forgiveness because they don't really know what it means. Forgiveness is actually not marked by feelings. It's marked by actions. Forgiveness is about releasing the offender to God and relinquishing the right to retaliation and resentment. I'm going to say that again, because that's really what forgiveness is all about. Forgiveness is about releasing the offender to God and about relinquishing the right to retaliation and resentment. Now, Joseph doesn't make a huge attempt to relieve his brothers of their feelings, of their guilt, nor should he. He instead responds with this mysterious question, asking them, "Am I in the place of God?" You see, Joseph is really good at understanding what is God's job and what's my job. What is God supposed to do in this process, and what is poor little Joseph supposed to do in this process? He knows that within the realm of God, there's things like divine justice and judgment. But in Joseph's worldview, it's kind of the human stuff, right? Like, you take care of your taxes, you take care of people you have responsibility for. That's human stuff. Divine justice and judgment, that's in the realm of God. And so he knows what he has authority and power over and what God has authority and power over. Or maybe he simply understands that he doesn't have the emotional capacity concerning his brother quite yet. Right? Maybe he understands the limits of his emotions right now about forgiveness in this kind of horrific act that happened to him as a teenager. After all, forgiveness is a process. It's not an event. And family hurts, family wounds, family pain has lasting power, as you all well know, right? We have wounds that go back generations in some families, right? It has lingering power. Joseph realized that punishment or judgment is within God's realm. And within his control is how he responds and interacts with his brothers. He can choose to act kindly, putting them at ease and offering care for them and their children due to his wealth and his privilege. It's a popular proverb in our society to say something like forgive and forget, right? We've all heard that phrase, forgive and forget. But the notion's not found anywhere in the Bible, right? It's not a biblical concept to forgive and forget. In fact, the Bible suggests there are some things that actually should not be forgotten, and that remembering them plays an important role in making sure we don't do it again, right? Like we have to remember things sometimes so that we don't do it again. And I think that's what's happening in this story. Joseph knows that it's God's job to reckon with the brothers over their sin. But at the same time, he refuses to allow their shared past to overshadow their potential future together. What Scripture does tell us, and perhaps it's something that should all maybe worry us a bit, it definitely worries me, is that in the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that Jesus taught his disciple, Jesus makes God's forgiveness contingent on our ability to forgive other people. Right? He says, "Forgive us our trespasses, just as we forgive those who trespass against us." According to the theologian Tom Wright, when we don't forgive, something actually shuts down inside of us that limits our capacity to actually receive God's forgiveness. Somehow our ability to forgive other people is connected to our ability to receive forgiveness from God. And that's kind of a critical piece in understanding why forgiveness matters. The second piece of wisdom is to work on becoming forgivingly fit. To practice forgiveness, it really helps for you to work on your kind of inner world by learning to become fit in your forgiveness area. You wouldn't, if you were going to run a marathon, right, you just wouldn't run it the next day. You'd work your way up to 26.2 miles, right? And the same is true for forgiveness. I mean, there are some people who are completely emotionally gutted when they have to make a big forgiveness ask of someone they love, because it's just so incredibly shocking for them and it comes out of left field, and I completely understand that. But one of the things that we do when we're trying to build meaningful, significant relationships is to begin to build trust by working on those little forgiveness muscles day in and day out. And if you build up your forgiving heart muscles slowly, incorporating regular workouts into your everyday life, you grow into a more forgiving heart. And I've often wondered why Joseph breaks down and cries when he gets this message from his brothers. We don't know why he cries. We can only speculate. But I wonder if it wasn't part of his process of becoming more forgivingly fit, because he cries in private. And I wonder if that's part of the exercise of becoming more forgiving, so that when they actually stood in front of him physically, he was able to speak kindly to them, right? Like if he hadn't worked in private on his inner world, maybe he wouldn't have been able to speak so kindly to them when they showed up. Now, I know we've heard all of those some of those dramatic stories, examples of forgiveness out there, like the one of the Amish community several years ago in Pennsylvania, after a man walked into their one-room schoolhouse and killed 5 little girls. He shot 10, and then he killed himself. And what was in the news stories was the response of the Amish community in responding to that horrific act, because they showed up at the killer's funeral. And they even donated money to the widow and the widow's 3 children. You don't arrive at those kinds of acts of forgiveness without cultivating a lifetime of forgiveness and beginning to see forgiveness as kind of an embodied way of living life. For us to become more forgivingly fit, we can begin by committing to practice what the United Methodists call their first general rule, which is to do no harm. In other words, a practical way that you can start to build up your forgiveness muscles and do no harm is by not talking negatively about people who have wronged you or hurt you. And I know we've all been guilty of this, right? Because when people hurt us, we want to lash out, right? You don't have to say positive or good things about them, but if you refrain from talking negatively about them, you can start to give more life to your forgiving heart muscles and the forgiving side of your mind and your soul. The good news is for us in all of our relationships, we have ample opportunities to exercise our forgiving side of our heart muscles, right? Right? Every day we have an opportunity to forgive the little things, right? The little things. And if we don't work on those little pieces, it makes it ultimately super hard when the hard stuff comes. So when we harbor resentments, when we allow hurts to fester, when we let it build into bitterness, that becomes injuries to our soul that make it harder and harder to forgive, especially when the relationship is on the line. The third piece of wisdom is to address your inner pain. Often we are not able to forgive because we are so hurt, so broken by the pain, the wound that we carry, we can't see beyond our pain in order to offer forgiveness to someone else. And this is where community comes in. And this might be a new concept for you because I think sometimes in our society we think of forgiveness as kind of a private exchange. It's between two people. But within the church, within Christian community, forgiveness is understood as a communal act, right? It's not solitary action, it's community-based. And you may need to lean on your community in order to build up strength for yourself before you're ever going to be able to consider forgiving someone else. One way to understand this is how a mother addresses the pain of a child, right? So when a child is hurt and comes to its mother, the mom acknowledges the child's pain. She makes it a reality. She allows the child to cry, right? To express their pain. And in doing so, that mother is teaching that child a really important lesson. That what is shareable is bearable. That what is shareable is bearable. And that's why it's so important to understand forgiveness and the concept of community. And some of the ways that what it looks like is it might be that we might need to seek professional help. Whether that's through counseling or spiritual direction or a peer-led grief group. To help us work on our inner pain so that we can begin to build up our forgiveness muscles and become a more forgiving person. Now, I can hear some of you saying, what in the world has Pastor Mike been telling Kim about the good people of Sikeston? Because we haven't done anything near as bad as the people that she is talking about, right? Like, we haven't tried to kidnap our brothers or kill him or sell him to be a slave, right? We haven't done anything like that, and that might be true. It might be true. But I think it's important to realize that Jesus doesn't make a whole lot of distinctions between the ways in which we harm one another, right? And so before we go any further, perhaps I should just talk to those people who are actually in need of forgiveness from someone else. Because when we talk in church, it's often about who do I need to forgive rather than the reversal. Because there are some of us in this room who are desperately hoping for forgiveness from someone else. So if you've never harmed anyone, if you've never betrayed someone or lied to a loved one or stabbed someone in the back, then you can just continue to scroll on your phone or, go and change the laundry for those of you at home. Because I think one of the things, because I've done all of those things, I've done much worse, right? So I'm in need of forgiveness from a lot of people. And I think one of the lessons as I read this story of Joseph and his brothers is I begin to realize, if I really want to reflect about it, that maybe, just maybe, I'm actually more like the brothers than I am like Joseph. And this story helps me reflect and be honest with myself about the ways in which we betray and hurt our fellow human siblings. And so this story of Joseph and his family mess allows us to meditate on the ways in which we've sometimes tried to speed up forgiveness or bypass apologies so that we can just get past all of the awkward stages or the tension or the hurt and move to this promised reconciliation. So what are we supposed to do when we are waiting on forgiveness to come? When we betrayed someone or laughed at someone or abused someone or insulted someone or ignored or slighted someone? I think it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes that other person may not be ready to offer us the forgiveness that we so desperately want. And during those moments, we have to draw on other strengths. We have to practice other virtues of things like patience and humility. Because sometimes we can do further harm by trying to bully someone into forgiving us. And that might be another reason why Joseph cried in the story. Again, remember we said we had to kind of speculate on why he cried, but maybe he was brought to tears by his brother's message because he was simply weary of being asked to do something that he really could not bring himself to offer. For those of us who are waiting on someone else's forgiveness, we've got to practice and work on our own inner pain. There might be some opportunity for us to offer some self-forgiveness, because sometimes we have to forgive ourselves before we can right the wrongs that we have committed, and that we can offer, before we can offer a true, sincere apology, free of conditions and expectations. You know, we often, here's another one of those kind of adages that we say that time heals, right? You've heard that before, time heals. But Henry Nouwen writes, the phrase is not true when it means that we will eventually forget the wounds inflicted on us and be able to live on as if nothing happened. That's not really healing. It's simply ignoring reality. But when the expression time heals means that faithfulness in a difficult relationship can lead us to a deeper understanding of the ways in which we have hurt each other, then there is much truth in it. Time heals implies not passively waiting, but actively working with our pain and trusting in the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. Lastly, I think this story teaches us that when forgiveness is hard, that we're to call on other strengths. Up to this very last chapter of Genesis, the brothers have really done a great job of making this story all about themselves. Right? They have been preoccupied with their plan to eliminate Joseph from their life, and now they're preoccupied with their plan to get Joseph to relieve them of their own guilt. And they're so consumed by this plan that they failed to see that, in fact, there was another plan already at play. And we hear this from Joseph himself because he reminds them of the plan unknown to all of them save God. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." As we said in the beginning, forgiveness is less about our feelings and more about one's response. Joseph teaches us that when you find it hard to forgive, the more you focus on God, the less we feel victimized by the past. Joseph turns to God for the work of removing the stain of sin, and instead he draws upon his other strengths like kindness and humility, reassuring the family that he will indeed take care of them. He will continue to provide for them and for their children. Friends, I don't know if we're ever going to know really what was in Joseph's heart. Did he ever truly forgive his brothers for the act that they committed against them? But what we do know is this. In the final verses of Genesis, it tells us that his brothers were with him when he died of old age. And I think that he probably spent a lifetime working on becoming forgivingly fit so that he could embody a forgiving heart. For those of us, disciples of Jesus Christ, this is how we become more like Jesus. We attempt every day to try to become a little bit more like him. Jesus spoke about forgiveness, and our holy scriptures are filled with one example after another of forgiveness and forgiveness bestowed upon one another, because it may very well be the primary exercise that helps us love one another as God loves us. And if we love one another, God's love is perfected in us. And if that happens, if God's love is perfected in us, then all of our relationships, those significant and insignificant, will truly be transformed. Thanks be to God. Amen.